I'm not going to use it now. No. Thanks very much for that welcome. Actually, I just begged him for 5 minutes extra, just in case. Because what I want to do is to just include our students that have worked very hard on this big map over here. And actually, we might need a bit of light on that too. I don't know how that's going to work. So they're our student interns. So there's Glenn. Do you want to give us a wave, please? Diane. And where's Jackie? We're waiting for Jackie. Okay. All right. So anyway, I just wanted to start with explaining with this map is a composition of all the different planning regulations and other scientific documents that have actually set the science, if you like, in a way, for showing all the different ecologically sensitive areas and Aboriginal areas, etc., etc. And so that's why I've called my presentation Joining the Dots, and it's 5 years towards the Sydney Marine Park. So what I'll be talking about as well is stories about the role of small groups of people in writing our planning history to protect our harbour. Their many planning victories are marked on this giant map, a great start for what we want to achieve today. Next slide, please. So with Cabbage Tree Bay, it was a long battle that taught us never to give up. We were told there was nothing there. It was too small. And a marine consultant in the area actually told me there was nothing there. Didn't I think that if there was, he would have written a report about it, and that he would tell council not to waste their time and money by being involved. As well as that, conservation officers working for various government agencies, etc., it turned out were champion spearfishermen whose partners would let them go out spearfishing to Cabbage Tree Bay because they would bring home a free feed. So it took us a while to work all this out, but anyway, we did it in the end. But also we had a Manly councillor who was president of the National Spearfishing Association, as well as a local business that was making money teaching people to spearfish in Cabbage Tree Bay. So there was quite a lot to sort of fight about, but anyway, by 2002, after having done a scientific survey, which we did with the assistance of Richard Nichols from Manly Dive, they gave some funding that they'd raised, as well as Paddy contributed to a scientific study that Sydney University did for us. And that came on top of a lot of student work as well that justified why that would happen. And so our Friends of Cabbage Tree Bay volunteers, which Robin Millwood runs, she's going to be doing a workshop later with the workshops, so you'll be able to join in and find out about that. And Richard's going to be speaking about it from the dive business point of view. So next slide, thanks. The North Harbour Aquatic Reserve, or North Sydney Harbour Aquatic Reserve to be correct, it was nominated by a citizen in 1979, and it was, I think, really amazing, because I don't know how much scientific training that person had, but he came up with a list of there was no study actually done, but of all the amazing creatures that actually, live in that area. And I think that's just amazing, and this is a beautiful photo that John Turnbull took of the kind of things that are there. We get quite a few tropical fish, etc., in that area too, as well as Cabbage Tree Bay. Next slide, thanks. The Mitchell-McCotter report was commissioned in 1986, and it stated in the objectives the need to undertake regional planning for Sydney had long been recognised. It was reinforced by the recommendations of the New South Wales Ombudsman 1982 and the Commission of Inquiry 1983 into a proposed marina in the harbour. Both expressed the view that the absence of coordinated planning and management of the foreshores and waterways was a problem requiring action by the state government. the Willoughby Environmental Protection Association started in 1982, and Phil Jenkin will be telling you about the work of many other citizen organisations that spurred it all on. Next slide, thanks. The Regional Environmental Plan number 23, you could say that these comprehensive separate plans for water and land were really our first steps in documenting the sensitive areas of our harbour. Next slide, thanks. So then we have the W2 Environmental Protection Zone, and Glenn's going to point those out because I'm hoping that after this we've spent weeks preparing this map, so I'm hoping that you will all have a bit of a look at it during the lunch break. So Glenn will point out where the W2 environmental protection areas are, and the objectives of those are to protect the natural and cultural values of waters in the zone, to prevent damage or the possibility of longer-term detrimental impacts to the natural and cultural values of waters in this zone and adjoining foreshores, and to give preference to enhancing and rehabilitating the natural and cultural values of waters in this zone and adjoining foreshores. So you'll see that these waters are in a number of places, and as well as that we've got the naval reserves as well, which Glenn will point out too. And of course nothing else is allowed in there, so it's a great way to protect habitat because there could be no fishing or any other activities in there. And then there's also the buffer zone for the flying boats, that's the aircraft down there as well. And then there's also the buffer zone, which I didn't mention, Glenn, but it's over near the Harbour Bridge, you'll see there, for the Opera House, which stretches from the Opera House side of the harbour to the other side. So that's the buffer zone for the World Heritage Area. Next slide. And we'll be having somebody talking about the shipwrecks, and Glenn, if you could just point out roughly where they are, and we've allowed an 800 metre zone around each of those 10 shipwreck sites. And of course there are plenty of documents, and Jackie, you could just point out some of the covers of all the different documents that cover this. There's something like, I think we did about a bibliography of about 80, and 51 of those are planning documents. So also there's other items there too, and did you point out the Spectacle Island Declaration up the top there? Yes, which Jeremy Dawkins will be talking about later, which is a great record of the values that we set on our marine heritage in the harbour. And then also there's the at the bottom there, all the research that was done, the Sydney Harbour Research Agenda down there. Jeremy will be talking about that too. I think that lists about over 100 different studies that have been done, research studies that have been done in the harbour. The next one I wanted to point out on the next slide, thanks, is the 85 heritage items which dot the harbour. This is in around the foreshores and in the water, and that there's actually a list of all those there with the numbers on them. And then if you could just point out a couple of them actually there in the water as well. Glenn, you could just point out with those marked with a little dot as well with a red centre, just so again that you can see the wealth of protection that there exists already. And next slide, thanks. And this one, it's from the Oil Spills Atlas, which was done for the whole of the New South Wales coast in 1994. And there's actually 15 of these EPA atlases, and they cover things like, as well as having maps of sensitive areas, seagrass beds, mangroves, nesting shorebirds, Aboriginal and heritage, European heritage, environmentally sensitive areas, and extremely sensitive areas, and fishing pressures. So they make a great resource that we can all access. They reinforce the recognition of and critical need to protect, conserve, and more effectively manage our marine biodiversity, populations of exploited species, and overall health of our marine life. And we've used the Sydney Harbour edition to map all of the above on our giant map, and its legend indicates from the colours and symbols what and where they are. So I'm just going to ask Diane now if you can just point out the legend up there, the different things. So we've got the W2 there at the top. You could also point out the extension to the Sydney Harbour National Park as well, that I'll just mention in a minute. Penguin critical habitat, and just show us where that is. And Angelica's here as well from the Penguin Wardens. And then the the Sydney Harbour Walk. So that's the red line that goes right around the foreshore. And this fulfilled Nielsen's vision of over a century ago of a walk around the harbour foreshore on public lands for public enjoyment. Phil Jenkin will fill you in on this and the many other walks his group has designed and mapped, as well as his great experience of walking from Palm Beach via Sydney Harbour down to Mundina in about a month recently. And there's some great videos on their website as well. Now we'll go to the next slide. That's the seagrass beds. Can everybody just point out where the seagrass beds are marked on the harbour? We had to put the words there rather than dots or something because it's not such a big area, it's more around the foreshore. Okay, next slide. And that's showing the Sydney Harbour Walk going around the foreshore. And this is the map that Glenn first did for us to have this concept of all the different areas of protection and significance on the harbour. And then Diane and Jackie have spent quite some weeks putting the giant map together so that you could all see it here today. Okay, next slide, thanks. And Angelica is actually here today. Just put your hand up, Angelica. I know you're very shy, but you know. And there's a great book about the penguins at Manly Wharf, and it's really fantastic because it tells the whole story right from the very beginning. And that all started when the first year I'd started the centre, an old codger came into the centre who'd always lived in Manly all his life and, you know, didn't you know that there's fairy penguins in Manly? And I thought, oh, this guy's having a lend of me, but, you know, he's so nice. So anyway, the local member, Peter MacDonald, and I actually went with him to see them one evening. And sure enough, there they were, coming ashore in the bottom of people's gardens and walking up steps and all kinds of things. And that was because that was where they were mainly at that time, just around Manly Point in private property, because the penguins that were in the national park for years got killed by dogs getting off boats. But now things are a lot better. And so at the time when we had them listed as a threatened population in Manly back in 97, we only had 17 pairs, but now through the diligence of the penguin wardens and others, we now have 70 pairs. And as well as that, the ones around the wharf appeared sort of, how long ago was it, Angelica? 11 years. And when Angelica saw them down there coming ashore at night, just a couple of pairs with all the dogs and the drunks and everything else, she came up with the idea of starting the Penguin Wardens, which is now a fantastic institution. And so the book tells the story of all of those people that have been involved, and it also tells the story of, you know, that in 1952 there were 300 penguins shot in Spring Cove in the national park. We think it was probably somebody at the Venereal Diseases Hospital who'd gone off their head and couldn't stand the noise. But anyway, it's a great history. The next slide, thanks. You've heard about the dioxin in Homebush Bay, from Homebush Bay, that's penetrating right up the harbour, to the extent that there are dietary warnings even in Manly saying that you shouldn't eat more than 150 grams per month. I would eat more than that in one meal, and because of the health risks. But it's not just the dioxin from the harbour. Next slide, please. The work of Professor Gavin Birch from Sydney University tells us about the lead and other heavy metal levels that are in the harbour. These have come from the 23 creeks, or little estuaries around the harbour foreshore, that were filled in to make playing fields and parks for humans. And they were, of course, filled in the 1930s when nobody knows what went into them. If we all think back to some of the older people like me, what we used to take to the tip, in inverted commas, in the way of chemicals and poisons and so on, we can imagine. And so what's happened is that is running off into the harbour sediments. And there's no way, I don't think, or anyone that I know knows, how they can be cleaned up or removed. And it's quite a serious issue when we consider that, I've got an extra 5 minutes, I hope. It's quite a serious issue when we consider the cumulative impact of the dioxins from Homebush and these heavy metal levels around all over the harbour. So it might be a reason to stop fishing, dare we say it, completely in the harbour, because there's nothing like health risks to justify things. And indeed, it seems from our research that that's how they noticed the dioxins from Homebush, because of the cancers that the families of commercial fishermen were experiencing. Okay, next one, thanks. So I've just put this slide up because I think it's very, very interesting that back in 2001, after another oil spill in the harbour, that Richard Jones had come up with this recommendation that there be an increase in the size of the North Harbour Aquatic Reserve and the creation of marine reserves within Sydney Harbour, and the declaration of Sydney Harbour as a marine park. Now, whilst the committee didn't accept that, we can say when we put it to Parliament that it's not the first time they've heard about it, which I think is important. It's always hard when the first time you mention something, you're usually rubbished. So anyway, the next one, thanks. And this is the extension I was talking about, that as a result of the Sydney Harbour National Park Plan of Management in 2012, one of the recommendations is to have this marine extension of the national parks on North Head going right around, you can just point it out again, Glenn, in case everyone's forgotten, right around North Head, that's the bright yellow, so that it joins up with the North Harbour Aquatic Reserve, which again you could just point out the North Harbour Aquatic Reserve there as well. So that could be quite interesting. Okay, next slide, getting to the end. And this is about the role of institutions, because I think we all need to work out from today what we're going to do to move things forward. And so I think one of the things that we found is that, and a lot of research has found, that institutions have unique credibility to promote the concept of a Sydney Marine Park to a wide and potentially new audience by encouraging them to mount an exhibition. And I know this works really well with climate change, because there was a conference at UWS a couple of years ago that you can change the public's beliefs about things when institutions get involved in exhibiting that kind of information. It takes it out of the belief system and puts it into just, oh, that's normal. Oh, okay, that's what we think now. And so in our case, the Australian Museum has already mounted a large exhibition just on Manly Cove back in 2002, and annually provides large areas for the Manly Environment Centre to promote their work in preserving Manly's unique species. But I think what's interesting about this photograph, it actually shows a a giant sunfish that was caught in Manly late in the 19th century, and it was so big it couldn't go through the front door of the museum and had to be taken up through a floor-story window. And they actually exhibited that at that Manly Cove exhibition, so they still have it. Next one, thanks. So yes, so joining the dots, you know, we've got Sydney Harbour and Greater Sydney that on the map on the side, and then we're looking at the role of institutions, and the Australian National Maritime Museum has permanent exhibitions on our shipwrecks. The New South Wales State Library has an interesting permanent exhibition on Aboriginal life relating to harbour waters, and recently had an exhibition on 18th century paintings of wildlife that were done in the early days of this colony. Customs House has its underfloor maps of Sydney and could host a marine exhibition. It's also likewise the Museum of Sydney has a permanent Aboriginal exhibition, and they're always very amenable to having additional features that we could be involved in. Sydney Coastal Councils represents 15 councils, and their Underwater Sydney section of their website features each council's local marine species. Their Summerama annual program of hands-on activities involving parents and children all around this city is a really good opportunity to be putting this concept of ours to families, not just grown-ups, because the kids really switch on to this sort of thing. And I think we should remember as well how successful Bill Ballantyne was in New Zealand with the father of marine reserves, and how he got school students involved in supporting the concept of marine conservation, and thus it had a big effect in getting those marine parks going. And so there's also the next one, and this Nature on Our Doorstep, and this National Tourism Plan, which I think is really, really great for us, because this National Tourism Plan is a unique cooperation between Commonwealth and state governments, Tourism Australia and the community as well. So there are 16 national landscapes, yes, and Sydney Harbour is one of them, covering the whole of coastal Sydney. There is a companion guide, a guidebook to making the most of your landscape positioning, as well as a 100-page supplement to the Australian Traveller magazine. So if people want to look at those later, I'll have them over on my table. And last slide, so everyone can relax now. And that is what makes Sydney Harbour unique. And this is the last page of that document that I just mentioned. And if you read it carefully, you'll see that there's the Aussie coastal life, an ancient culture, forming the landscape, distinctive harbour, the gateway, beach culture, national parks and world heritage. All of these things that should be part of our case. And I'm really hoping that these final points give you the tools to seal the deal. Thank you.